Hey everybody, it's Chuck Garfien. Welcome back to the podcast, and I am back from the winter meetings, and we've got another big week of podcasts lined up for you, starting with this one today. And the big story is the White Sox trading Garrett Crochet to the Red Sox, and by now you know who the White Sox are getting, but today we're going to dive into what the White Sox are getting in Kyle Teel, Braden Montgomery, Chase Meidroth, and Wikelman Gonzalez. Because on the podcast, we've got prospect aficionado Kiley McDaniel, who used to work for the Yankees and the Orioles and the Pirates and the Braves, also at FanGraphs, but now he's a baseball insider at ESPN, mainly covering the draft and prospects. And we're going to get his thoughts on the Crochet trade. In fact, he predicted it. He predicted it right before the winter meetings. And then we're going to have a really interesting conversation comparing this trade with the Chris Sale trade from 8 years ago. Which one is better? You're going to feel like you're in the room, in the front office of the White Sox or any other team in baseball, because Kylie was. And Kylie knows exactly what's going on in these front offices, and he's got wisdom and perspective and information to share as we break down the Garrett Crochet trade. It is coming your way. Let's go. All right, here on the podcast, it is Kiley McDaniel from ESPN. And Kylie, before we begin, I want to talk about your interesting career path, because you started by working for teams, and then you moved over to the dark side, to our side, to the media. So what did you do in baseball, and how did you get to ESPN?
I actually refer to the team side as the dark side now, so I guess it just matters on your perspective. Yeah, I read Moneyball as a high school senior. It was like when it came out, and I was, trying to get like internships and all the stuff that everyone does at that point. And then obviously, pre-Moneyball. And I wasn't like a D1 level athlete. So it was like, oh, I'm not going to get the whole, like, I played football as like a backup at Virginia, therefore I can be on the Bill Belichick staff. Football was kind of my other sport. And then Moneyball came out, and I was like, oh, this sport lets people that aren't good at it participate in like the process of it. And I was like, all right, that's a good idea. And so I interned with the Rays. And then in college, I went to college in Orlando at UCF while I was living in Tampa. I'd come back home in the summers, live with my parents, and then the Yankees office in Tampa. And eventually my boss there was Billy Epler, who I basically bugged him and his boss for over a year. And then they were like, we'll bring you in for like, a day or two a week here or there for no pay, because you were allowed to do that back then. And then after my first day, I did a filing project, and he was like, you know what? We'll just have you come in every day. So I came in like every day for the summer for 3 years and didn't get a job out of that. But that kind of got me going to where I was going back and forth between the media and internships and scouting. And then my sort of, peak professionally, I guess, was with the Braves when I got to kind of be involved in a bunch of stuff before that whole thing imploded. And then I went back to FanGraphs, ended up at ESPN. And as I got to ESPN, wrote a book. And then as I went there, they got the rights to the draft broadcast. So I was able to sort of, I guess, be described by ESPN as the Mel Kiper of the draft, which was really exciting, having grown up watching Mel Kiper and the baseball draft not being on TV for a long time. So yeah, I guess that's the express route through all my various things.
Yeah, and it gives you a lot of credence because you know baseball really well, and you were on that side. I was never in the front office. I've just been a sportscaster and a sports fan, and you blend both of them together. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this trade. And not only are you a writer, are you an analyst, but you are a psychic. You are a psychic, Kylie, because it's very tough to predict a baseball trade. Tough to predict where a guy is going to be traded. Extremely tough to predict what's coming back in return. And before the winter meetings, you predicted Crochet would be traded to the Red Sox. And then you said, for something like Kyle Teel and Braden Montgomery, and boom, well done. How'd you do it?
So we were talking before we started recording that there is I won't go into super deep depth, but like over here, I have my spreadsheet with all of my like rankings and numbers and stuff. There is essentially a math problem behind, like, if you said, how much is Garrett Crochet worth? And I hadn't thought about it before. I could do like 2 minutes of sort of calculations and be like, oh, it should be one player in the top 75 prospects in baseball, one guy just outside of that group, and then one or two other guys. And I could like explain the whole process. It's kind of boring, but there is essentially a way, like a very simple way to say Garrett Crochet is worth 67 million or whatever it is in surplus value, and then go over to my spreadsheet where everyone is ranked and say 67 million. All right, we'll do one guy that's worth 55 million, one guy that's worth 14, and then like that sort of thing. So I was doing that process to sort of see like what ballpark of guy should be involved. And with the Red Sox specifically, I thought it was like somewhat easy because they have 4 guys that are all hitters that are in the upper levels of the minors. They're in the top 50 prospects in baseball. And I was like, the Marcelo Meyer, Roman Anthony, like arguably the top prospect in baseball. They're in the running for that. They're in the top 10. I was like, they're not going to touch those guys. And Christian Campbell, the guy that like kind of turned into something out of nothing as a 3rd round pick, he has the potential to be that good, but he had one good season after signing. So I'm like, because that guy could be like a dude, I don't think they might not be selling high. Like he might just be rising. So I was like, they would probably have to trade the 4th guy of that group, which is Kyle Teel. And his value is more that he is average to above average at everything at a premium position in the upper minors, 6.5 years or 6 and change years of control. And I was like, that I think if they could justify it as we traded one of those guys, but it was the worst of those guys without a chance to be like a 10-time all-star, more of a very good player that could make an all-star team and could be, because with catchers especially, it's like if you're a little above average at everything, you're like a top 8 guy in baseball. So that's still a really good player, but it's not the guy that's going to turn into a superstar face of a franchise that'll really hurt. And so if you then do the math problem when you start with Teal, you're like, well, you probably have to go to the next best guy they have. And there's 3 or 4 candidates. And I picked Braden Montgomery because obviously every team just evaluated him because he was the 12th pick in the draft. So every team has about the same eval on him. And he broke his ankle at the end, right before the draft. So he hasn't played. So like his value can't have changed at all. And I know the White Sox were drafting a little too high last year when they took Hagen Smith to take Montgomery. So I was like, all right, that guy makes sense. I'll do those 2. And if you would have made me guess the 3rd guy, I might have guessed the 3rd guy too.
Come on.
Because Meidroth is a guy that is, while Teal is like a very steady, will be in the big leagues next year guy, Montgomery is like a little bit of a shot in the dark, a little bit of a swing and miss, hasn't played pro ball yet, might be 3 years away, like a little bit of a risk. Meidroth is like maybe a 70 grade hitter with a 70 grade approach, but not a lot of power, not a lot of speed, not a lot of defensive value. So he's like a really good bench platoon guy that if he really hits, he could be like a Tommy La Stella where he hits so much he's a starter. But if he doesn't, he's a really good bench guy that you have for 6 years for free. And you're saving, $5-6 million a year on who that guy is and what that guy would cost in the free agent market. If you're going sort of high floor with Teal and then higher ceiling with Montgomery, it makes sense to go high floor with Meidroth, get 3 position players, and then throw in a lottery ticket pitcher in Gonzalez, which, that could have been anyone at 10 guys. So the interesting thing to me is that both teams agreed with my logic. Like my logic made sense. I just don't know what I don't know that those teams are aware of. And it turned out it wasn't really that much or everything canceled out. So I wasn't like shocked that it worked out that way. I was just surprised that like my sort of math matched their math, which I've had teams tell me they do that same math problem I just suggested. And then they adjust for like sort of supply and demand in the market and all the stuff that like changes constantly. But that basic math problem is what the teams do.
Yeah, so I was out to dinner on Tuesday night and come back to the hotel in Dallas, and who do I see in, I don't want to call it the lobby, but in an area where there are a lot of people? I see Chris Getz, and he's talking with the Red Sox assistant GM Mike Groupman, and I'm like, wait, okay, hold on a second. Wait, he's talking to someone from the Red Sox right here in the middle of like the lobby, and I can't tell if they're talking about a trade, but they're talking.
And not a guy that like he necessarily worked with in the past where,
with the
like
Royals. He worked with them in the Royals.
Yeah.
And so I did so I interviewed Chris the next day after they made the trade. And I said, hey, I saw you and Mike talking in the lobby. Were you guys talking about the trade? And he said, you're that was like this. I don't know if it was the start of it, but they definitely were hatching out some stuff at that point, and there it is, right in the middle of everybody walking by. There's the Garrett Crochet trade kind of coming together. But how do you think the White Sox did with this return?
So I have been, I would say, critical of Getz's trades. I think they've all been like fine, but I would prefer the other side of them. Not in like these are awful, he's unqualified. Just like, I'd like slightly prefer the other side. I don't really understand like what the aim is here. I thought the stuff at the deadline was fine, but maybe should have gotten an extra guy in both of the deals. This one, I think he did a good job. I think, again, if you go back to that math problem of like what you should get, I think with Crochet being arguably the best talent that's been on the trade market since Juan Soto, like getting an ace for 2 years at like 10 to 12 million combined over the next 2 years. Like that is that amount of surplus value that he'd be delivering is so high that you then, when you look at that math problem, you're like, well, you have to round up because there's not another guy like this. There's not other guys that deliver this value. No team wants to pay the market rate on starting pitchers. They want to get a guy well below market. And if you look at that math problem, it's like, oh, they got whatever it is, 10% more than like Crochet was worth, but it was spread over 4 players. So it was like, oh, this is what they had to be able to get this. These days, I think it is very hard, especially with the free agent market being very hot, to get people to give up more young players than they should, to give like the Shelby Miller trade, for instance. I was working in Atlanta the year that happened, and it was just sort of like everyone was dumbfounded. We're sitting in a meeting like, oh, we should get this. And it's like, and we got a whole extra top 100 prospect on top of that? Like, holy cow. Like, that doesn't really happen anymore. And I think there was a period between now and that trade that a bunch of teams assumed if they waited long enough, somebody would offer that trade. And I think there were a lot of like trades not done because there was an expectation that those deals would get done. And so like, I think an A would be, holy cow, how did they get this many players, which doesn't really happen. So, I mean, you could call this, even if you adjust for what the market is, like I called it a B, like maybe it's a B plus if we compare it to other trades that happened this offseason. Like they got what they needed to. If I was picking the players, I might've picked slightly different guys, but from the same like value bucket. And like, obviously we won't know for 2 or 3 years until, you know, if they pick the right guys or not. So I think it was a good job, and I'm not sure that like, great job A plus was even possible, like just with the way the market is right now with young players. So you could even say it's a little higher than that.
So here's what Red Sox chief baseball officer Craig Breslow said after the trade. He said, speaking with the media, he said, our system is deep and there's a ton of quality and a ton of really, really good players. Now this is me talking. That would be really nice to have a farm system where you could actually say that. Okay, back to Craig. And so we felt like we were in a position to withstand the cost, but there's no doubt in the 4 guys that we gave up really good players. And that seems to be the consensus. Even, you know, as the 4th player in Wikelman Gonzalez, and we can talk about him a little bit further in a little bit. I just feel like this was a solid trade, really good trade, and potentially deep. And I think what I also see is this is 4 of these guys they really looked at makeup. They really looked at character. And does that matter to you at all in your evaluation of prospects? Are you just going off of talent?
It does. The problem is I get an inconsistent amount of that information. Like for instance, in the draft where I feel like I'm the most sort of plugged in, there are guys that, you know, on the 20-80 scale, scouts will say this guy has 80 makeup, like Walker Jenkins, who the Twins took 2 years ago, 5th overall. Guys would like readily say like, it's the best makeup I've seen in, 5, 6, 7 years, like harken back to some guy that's already been an all-star multiple times as like the last guy that was like this. So when a guy's really, really great at that, I tend to hear about it, whether in the draft or in the low minors or things like that. Like everybody loves this guy. There also is some level of like when some guys are average at makeup, however you want to define that. Actually, this yellow book behind me is a book where myself and Eric Longenhagen tried to define like how we should define makeup, which we defined as like between the lines, just outside the line. So like sort of practice batting cage and then off the field. Like those are the 3 categories. Yeah. Teams do not talk about it in that specific of detail. It's like, oh, good or bad. And then you have to ask questions to figure out what they mean. And there are guys like Nick Swisher where like seems great. If you're on a last place team, nobody wants to be around that guy. If you're on a World Series team, everybody loves that guy. So it's like also situational too. And there's some teams like they joke about like you can have 1 idiot, we can have Manny Ramirez, we can't have 7 idiots running around. There's like a balance where there's like some chemistry between them. So it's kind of, and there's also guys like I wrote about in the book, Javi Baez, and people thought he had the worst makeup in baseball and then thought he was a 70 makeup guy when he got to the big leagues because like he had a family member die and he changed as a person. I've heard similar things about Gary Sanchez when like he got married and had a kid, but he's like a different guy. So like it changes over time. Like you can be right that it was bad at one point and then be right that it was good later and like be able to explain it. And it's like, well, you didn't want that guy in the draft because he had bad makeup. It's like, yeah, but I should have known he had the potential to have good makeup. So all that to say, it's like a really complicated puzzle that like teams regularly get it wrong. And I'm not sitting down with every player. So I don't even have the complete information that they have. And even complete information is not going to give you the right answer. So unfortunately, when there's a guy like Walker Jenkins that everyone just goes nuts about and he's healthy and playing well, I can round him up a little bit because I know that it's good until someone tells me it's bad, because that's possible. And when someone's like terrible, it's usually a young guy that's being immature. So I have to sort of like stay on top of it. But like 80-90% of the guys are some version of close to average, pretty good. It's not a relevant piece of information, and I don't usually have it. So I just, you sort of ignore it at some level until you like have to pay attention to it.
All right, so your mid-season rankings, you do your own rankings. Now, the White Sox didn't get anybody in the top three. You mentioned Roman Anthony, Marcelo Mayer, and Christian Campbell, but they got, according to MLB Pipeline, the 4th, 5th, 14th, and 15th best prospects in the Red Sox organization. Your mid-season rankings, you had Teal ranked 34th. You did not put Montgomery in your top 100. Is that correct?
Correct. He was just outside. I think he was like 110 or something. But
Okay.
yeah, you could call him on the extended list.
So Teal, I just look at him and I don't know. I mean, I'm just new to following what he's all about. Seems like a really great competitor, good catcher, left-handed catcher, which is tough to find, right? And and knocking on the door for the major league. So what do you see in Teal?
I think he's an above average, not like a Yadier Molina, but like an above average defender where you don't have to worry, is this guy going to be a catcher? It might settle at average, might be a little above, but like good catcher that you don't have to worry about. I think there's 20 home run power in there, which would be above average power. Obviously, the like amount of playing time catchers get regularly is also like impacts these things. And I have noticed that in an effort to get to his power in college, and I think it's still mostly true, I think he's one of those guys where he's either going to hit 240, 250 with 20 homers, or he's going to hit 270 with 12 homers. He's one of those guys that kind of gets to pick one or the other, but probably can't do both. And then also with the rigors of catching and things like that, that can kind of get ground down a little bit, which is why if a very casual fan is hearing this, they're like, you're telling me this guy's going to hit 250 with 16 homers and play pretty good defense, and this is like a top 10 catcher in baseball? Go look at the leaderboard. That is a top 10 catcher in baseball. And to get that guy for the league minimum for 3 years and then a discount on his free agent price for 3 years, like that is worth $40-50 million above what you're paying him. And that is like the bulk of what Garrett Crochet's value. Again, we're talking about that math problem. Like that doesn't sound like, oh my gosh, we're so excited about this guy. But if you want a guy with more upside than that, that is similarly ranked, there's a chance that guy is nothing. Like that guy's probably an A-ball with insane tools. And, could be Byron Buxton or could be Lewis Brinson. You might not know who that is. And that's kind of the point, is like to get that variance, you have to be able to put up with what's at the bottom. Whereas Kyle Teel is like going to be in the big leagues next year, might even start the year in the big leagues if you want to. I think it's probably more of a midseason guy, but you're going to get 6. And if you do it the right way, you might get 6.5 years of him for that discounted price, which, is tremendously valuable.
Yeah, and for White Sox fans, we're trying to figure out, like, okay, what is the plan here? And I can't give you the whole plan because I don't know the whole plan. But essentially, if you hit on enough of these prospects, and the White Sox are not going to be spending much money for the next year or two, but trust me, everybody, they will spend money once they know where to spend the money. Now, you can argue, well, Jerry Reinsdorf from the White Sox, they don't go all the way. I don't know what they're going to do, but they will go. I mean, you know what's crazy? People forget this. I'm going to ask you this. Do you know, and it's a loaded question, you can know the answer. Do you know who had the highest payroll in the American League Central last season?
Was it Minnesota?
The White Sox.
Really?
With 121 losses. The problem the White Sox have had is they've spent money. They didn't spend it the right way.
Yeah.
This is a new front office, and I don't want to get into the weeds of like, can this front office make the right decisions there? But the point is that they got to hit on enough of these prospects. So you get a Kyle Teel making the league minimum or making very little, so you can go out and spend around him, and that would be, part of what they're trying to do here. But there's Edgar Caro, and people are saying, why would they get a catcher? Their future catcher is Edgar Caro. I have my thoughts on this, but I want to hear yours, the experts, first as to why they would get another catcher, and then I'll share mine.
So I'm currently going through my process of ranking all the prospects for usually right after the Super Bowl it comes out. So I haven't like updated it in the last month or two, but Caro is one of those guys that's on the catcher to first base spectrum, maybe left field, maybe DH, maybe part-time. And so I think in terms of like team building, if you can have the like obvious, this is a catcher, and then this guy's pretty good, that both gives you a chance to not have to go to free agency to get your backup or make a trade, or have a guy that's a total sink that you don't want playing at all. So that then if the regular catcher gets hurt, you're in a bad spot. And then also if it turns out Carroll and Teal are both who you think they can be, then Caro can be the guy that rotates in at DH and first base and left field and catches some, and Teal can have a breather and be a better guy late in the season. Like, I think it's actually a better way to build a team, to have a like obviously good defensive catcher and then a pretty good defensive catcher. Caro's in that area too, where there are some teams that think there's enough sort of soft skills and framing and things like that he could be a good defender, and other teams look at more the how well he moves sort of hard scouting stuff and say, I don't think he can do it. So that's like the flavor of it, where we've seen guys like Gary Sanchez or William Contreras be on that track where they end up being Gary Sanchez, I'd say good enough. William Contreras, I think, has been pretty good, like maybe above average in some respects because he's such a good receiver. And we've seen Austin Wells, rookie at the Yankees, another guy that like doesn't seem to have the physical tools, but is so good at the soft skills and the framing that he ends up grading out as one of the best catchers in baseball. Patrick Bailey, a guy that has both of those things, obviously Yadi Molina. So I think having guys at different parts of that spectrum, I think is actually smart. So I don't think they're duplicative at all. I think they're different kinds of guys, and you probably need one of each.
One thing Chris Getz said is that, Teal has played some outfield. He's more athletic, I believe, than Caro. So that is a possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could end up in the outfield in some fashion. But my feeling is this. Okay, how about some freaking depth at catcher? And if both hit, great. And you know what you can do if both hit and you have a need somewhere else? You trade one of them. Is that
good players is not a problem. I think a lot of people like to make it that way.
I mean, and you don't know. These are, again, prospects. I like Edgar Caro. I love his potential. Is he going to hit in the major leagues? Is he going to be able to catch the major leagues? I don't know. But now you got two guys vying for it. Yeah, and you have Corey Lee as well. So I have no problem with him being there. Hopefully he becomes something. Chase Meidroth, plate discipline. Can I have like 10 more players like Chase Meidroth? I saw some video of him. He's got to be, and now granted, I'm just looking at one game. He saw like 30 pitches in one game or something crazy like that. Tell us about him and what he can bring.
Yeah, it's a guy that if I give you comps of like, Tommy La Stella and Mark Bellhorn and guys like that, you don't get excited. Frank Catalanato. Like there's a lot of guys like this that like kind of find their way onto really good teams, being the guy that maybe is the odd man out utility platoon bench guy leading into the season. Then somebody gets hurt or somebody underperforms or whatever, and this guy becomes the everyday guy, and you don't have to worry about him. Like, he's going to perform. There's different versions of this guy, whether it's the high-end version of Ben Zobrist or the mid-level version of, like, Kike Hernandez. Like, good teams always have these guys, and bad teams always have below zero WAR, below replacement level dudes that are like don't belong in the big leagues because they don't think about bench players when you're not a good team, because you shouldn't. And that's part of the reason they end up being bad teams. Is really good teams like Milwaukee tend to have like all their backups are good players that they find roles and make them succeed and are good at improving them. And bad teams just have like -7 WAR from all their backups and spot starters and middle relievers. So like the easy, like if you were to talk to somebody about how to lose weight and you'd be like, oh, well, just don't drink 7 Diet Cokes a day. Like, that'll be real easy. You'll take a big jump forward immediately. Like, not having laugh out loud terrible players on the field, which is not a White Sox specific thing. Every bad team has this problem. I grew up in Tampa when the Rays were the worst team in baseball, and they were running out Ray Ordonez because he was bad, because they were tanking. And it was just like difficult to watch as a young fan. But like being able to have those kinds of guys bouncing around, fans may look at him and say, oh, he only had 400 plate appearances and he's not that good of a defender at second base. Like, that was a bad trade because Montgomery's not here yet. And like, Teal's on the IL or whatever. And it's like, no, that's not what he's supposed to do. He's there to raise your floor as a team and be a real player. And then the other part of it is this is a kind of player that is very in fashion for progressive leaning teams like Cleveland and Tampa and Milwaukee that tend to get more out of players than is expected. Some of these guys end up having no power, and so they end up being Vidal Brujan or Tyler Freeman or Xavier Edwards, which are kinds of players these guys have taken. Sometimes they turn into Jose Ramirez. If you think this guy is, he's not like a conventional NFL athlete and he doesn't have a ton of power and he's not a great defender. Like, Nolan Arenado was a bad defender. Mark Vientos was a bad defender. Jose Ramirez didn't have any power. Like, sometimes getting a guy that's really good at the one thing that matters, like, or I guess the two things that matter, making contact and having a good at bat. And he also can stand in the right places and plays passable defense. Like, sometimes everything works. And I think smart teams tend to want to bet on the stuff you can't teach, having a good eye and being able to put the bat on the ball. And you can kind of, like we've seen with like the, swing revolution and stuff, you can kind of teach power. You can kind of improve athleticism. You can improve the soft skills around defense. You can make a guy a good base stealer that isn't necessarily fast. Like, you can teach those things. You can't teach these two things. And he might be near the top 5 in the minor leagues in both of those skills. And he can play the infield, and he's in the upper minors. And you get him for the league minimum for 3 years. So it's like, obviously, if you could like auction off the next 3 years of this player, like, teams might pay $15 million. And I don't think fans are probably looking at that guy and thinking, oh, this guy's worth 8 figures of, surplus value. But like, there's a real chance that he is. And there's like a tiny chance that he's like a superstar. Like, I don't think it's likely, but there's an unexpected amount of superstars coming from this bucket where fans will think that it's Byron Buxton or Carlos Gomez or these just like crazy workout guys. Like sometimes Cliff Lee is an ace throwing 89 or Dallas Keuchel wins a Cy Young. Like sometimes that happens. So taking a risk on a guy with a lot of soft skills sometimes has like a hidden upside to it.
So when I looked him up, I saw he had a 437 OBP last season. I'm like, oh, that was probably in AA. No, that was in AAA.
Yeah.
Like,
and this was like a 5th round pick like 2 years ago. Like he had almost no value like very recently because he was at such a low level of college. If he was in the SEC, he would have been a 1st or 2nd round pick. But playing on the West Coast in these smaller conferences, like it wasn't obvious that he was that good at this because he wasn't facing good enough pitching to know for sure.
And this is the 3rd player in the trade. So I want to get to Braden Montgomery. I'm guessing you would believe he has the highest upside, highest ceiling for these 4. Is that where you're at with him?
I think so. I'm a little bit lower on him than the, we'll say, public rankings, because the concern in the draft was, so he went from a sort of swing and miss guy with an okay, not great approach that had crazy tools. That was him going back to sophomore year of high school in Mississippi when he was, heralded as a potential 1st round pick. He went to Stanford, got a little bit better, but wasn't making huge strides, and then transferred, big sort of NIL portal guy to Texas A&M for his last year before the draft. And he took his swing from like going from here to here to going from like here to here. Like he just shortened it down dramatically and still had was hitting it out of the stadium in batting practice by doing this. Like he didn't need to be doing all this and he didn't know.
So for everyone who's not who are only listening to this, can you explain what you're doing there?
So there's a concept called separation in a swing, which is when you start with your hands like in the middle of your chest and then move them far away like a rubber band to create power. That's how far you're separating from your starting point to where how far your hands get away from your body. The further away they get, the more strikeouts you're going to have. Yes. Like that's just like the short version. Guys with long arms that strike out a lot, their hands get really far away, a big separation. His separation, he basically cut it in half. He wasn't even getting to his other shoulder. If you look up Kylie MCD on Twitter, I took a bunch of high-speed video of him at South Carolina showing like how small it was in batting practice, and I assumed it was going to get big in the game, and it never did. So with that being said, he made big strides in his approach and his contact. He still swung and missed a lot at soft stuff below the zone, which if he has bat to ball ability and he has improved his approach and he quieted his swing, you would think that that is a matter of discipline, of learning not to do that, not that he is incapable of identifying that pitch. And then leading into the College World Series, he breaks his ankle in like a somewhat gruesome way, but everyone assumes that he'll be back at some point this season and back to normal and everything. But he has 30 home run potential. He has an 80 grade arm. He's been up to 97, 98 on the mound, but he won't be a pitcher in pro ball. He's a good corner defender in right field. So there is a chance that he could hit 260, 340 on base, 30 home runs, above average defender. Like that sort of sounds like low rent Kyle Tucker. Like he could be that. But sometimes when these guys are in the best college conferences and show you a bit of a weakness in soft stuff below the zone, it just gets worse and worse. And he turns into a platoon, a Josh Reddick, or even worse than that, depending on how much contact there is. Is he like Kyle Teel where he has to choose, is he contact or is he power? Like that's why he is seen as a higher variance, high upside, possibly low floor guy, depending on how that works out. And I think probably back end of 2025, early 2026, we'll have enough information from the low minors to figure out where he is there. And I think it'll be a good test for the White Sox player development staff because there is like a thing that needs to be addressed that a lot of the league, like there was some talk he was going to go 3rd, 4th, 5th overall and he got to 12th. It wasn't because of his ankle. It was because of the swing and miss. The league is sort of pausing. And if he can have a 16% strikeout rate and a 200 ISO in high A this year, like he will shoot up the list. He'll be in the top 50 in baseball. Like that is what you need to look for if he can do both of those things.
Chris Getz says he'll be ready for spring training, health wise, because he broke his ankle. And, he also said he thinks he can be a quick riser in the minor leagues. Do you feel that way about him too? You kind of in a way are saying it. If he turns
he's
out,
shown the ability to make the adjustment. So if the adjustment is he needs to shorten up even more, he's shown he can do that. Most guys at this stage have not had to go from big separation to small separation and got better numbers with the same amount of power. Like he's proven that he can do that, which is another good example when you were talking about makeup. When I don't know what it is, that tells me it's not terrible because he figured that out. Bad makeup guys don't figure that out. They get hard-headed and don't make adjustments. Yeah.
I've seen a little of him get interviewed. He seems to be a very, very high makeup kind of guy. Wikelman Gonzalez, great name. Wikelman Gonzalez. So he's got great stuff. All right. And I looked at him, just his game log from last year. And, he had 3 straight starts in August in AA. and he went 4 innings, 5 innings, 5 innings, gave up 3 hits total with no runs. So like, and he'll go through stretches where you're looking at these numbers, he's unhittable, and then he'll get you struggling. So that either says to me, okay, he's a future starter with a lot of walks, or he's going to the bullpen, or he figures it out and he's an ace or something like that. So what can you tell me about him?
So you were correct. It's like 3+ pitches, good delivery, can go deeper into games, or at least throw a lot of pitches. He has the stamina to start and the stuff to start, which like those two things together, hard to find. He's thrown a lot of innings in the minor leagues. He gets a lot of strikeouts. The walks aren't like hilariously bad, like 1 walk per inning. It's like, 4.5 per 9, like 1 walk every 2 innings, which ideally you'd like it at 3, one walk per 3 innings, but he's just going so deep into counts. He can't do that. And so if he can get to the point where not even the command of like hitting a spot, but the control of throwing it over the plate, his stuff moves enough that he can just throw it over the middle of the plate the way like Tyler Glasnow does, and just sort of dare hitters, especially in the minor leagues, to hit it. So the other issue is he's on the 40-man roster, which means he's burning options in the minor leagues. And we've seen this before with guys where, like, I know the Braves had Huascar Ynoa that was this kind of guy where he looks like a starter. You want him to be developed as a starter, but next year he'll be out of options, which means he has to go through waivers to go to the minors. So you then are forced to make him a reliever so that you can justify putting him on the big league roster, so you don't lose him for nothing to a last place team that can afford to let him go out there and be a below, replacement level guy and do all the stuff that a last place team can do that a first place team can't do. So he's on that road. I don't have his options in front of me. You have to go to the FanGraphs roster resource page, see how many options he has. That's how many seasons he has to figure it out. And if it looks like when he has half a season until he's out of options that he can't turn over a lineup, then he's going to get put in the bullpen. And because he has 3+ pitches and can throw it generally around the strike zone, that would be a guy that is very valuable, because if it clicks at any point, then you've got a potential, mid-rotation starter. But if he doesn't, there's a guy that can get swings and misses, can go multiple innings, can face righties and lefties because he has a good changeup. He offers that to you, but he's on a clock now. Whereas if this was a guy in A-ball that was 18, that's got 3 years till he has to be on the 40-man, and then 3 years of options, you got 6 years to figure it out. There's all kinds of road to find this option. That's why Boston traded him, is because they have a number of guys like this. And so this is like a problem that as a competitive team, they don't want to deal with. But as a less competitive team, this is the benefit you had. You can get more guys on minor league deals. You can get guys on waiver claims. If another guy like this on another team gets passed through waivers with no options, the White Sox can continue to claim these guys. And so this is essentially a lottery ticket where you hope that he can throw early in the count strikes, not get whacked around by big league hitters, and then he can get to that second time through the lineup and throw that slider off the plate, get the chases, get to 5 innings, have the 3 or 4 hits and the 7 strikeouts, and this guy is a good starter. That I would say is like a 1 in 5 chance you do that. There's a lot of guys sort of like this in the minor leagues, but he's one of the better ones in that he's shown the stamina and the 3 pitches and the plus stuff and the strikeouts. That's a rare group of guys, but you have a short window for Brian Bannister and that crew to figure it out. And I'm guessing they already have an idea of what they want to do.
A lot going on there.
Yeah. But the funny thing is, if it's just like get ahead with your fastball in the strike zone, like it's actually really simple, but like the way you get that to happen, because Boston's pretty sharp and they haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah.
So all like right. it like seems simple, but it's probably complicated.
No. I when I say a lot going on there, there's less runway with Gonzalez.
Yes.
So they got to figure this out sooner, so to speak. All right, so I want to wrap up the podcast. I want to do this. I wanted to do this with someone, and you're like the perfect person to do this with. Comparing this trade with the Chris Sale trade. So I listened back to the podcast that we did back right after Chris Sale got traded. This is from the Winter Meetings 2016. This was episode 11 of this podcast.
I was working for the Braves. It was at the DC Winter Meetings. Yeah. This was episode 11 of this podcast. We are now at episode 972. So this was in the infancy of this podcast. And Dan Hayes was our White Sox insider, and he spoke to 4 or 5 executives, scouts, agents at the Winter Meetings. The consensus was the White Sox did really well. One team didn't like it. The person said, or one person on the team didn't like it. The opposing team says, as freakishly talented as Moncada is, they were worried about his strikeout rate, worried about Kopech's injury history. He punched a wall, broke his hand. All right. So this is a really interesting comparison because Moncada was the minor league player of the year. FanGraphs at the time had Benintendi as the Red Sox first
their top-ranked prospect. Moncada was second. Devers was fourth, and the Sox couldn't get Devers. Kopech was sixth. Luis Basabe was the Red Sox 10th best prospect. He never made it past Double-A with the White Sox.
Yep.
And then Victor Diaz, unranked. He was out of baseball 1 year later.
I wasn't nuts about those two guys at the time, and I assumed there was something I was missing, and it seems like there was none.
Yeah, and so now Sale at the time was a 5-time All-Star, top 6 in the Cy Young Award voting for 5 straight seasons, 3 years left on his contract, making about $12 or $15 million, so much more than Garrett Crochet.
So to me, that very obviously has more value than Crochet, because it was essentially what Crochet did, but like 5 straight years of it and an extra year of control. So like you should have gotten more in that trade than the Crochet trade return. And I would say, just from like the prospect status, Moncada, what he was at that time, was like, I would say, consensus top 5 prospect in baseball, I believe.
Yeah.
Like that, those guys don't get traded anymore. Like that guy isn't not available in Crochet's deal. Like the team will hang up if you bring the name up. And then Kopech, if I remember correctly at that point, was seen as like a probably good big league starter, but maybe a reliever, which obviously is almost exactly what happened. Like what he turned into is what everyone thought he was going to be, which was maybe a number 2 starter that, like, you know, makes you pound your head on the table. Maybe like an inconsistent number 4 starter, maybe a setup guy. And I think he's been basically all of those over that time. But I would say Moncada was clearly better than Teal, because he had a similar floor. Again, we saw the ceiling and the floor, but was a better prospect because the ceiling was so high, which he kind of tickled at a couple seasons there. He gave you that like 4 or 5 win player that, like, I don't really think Teal can do that consistently. He might have like a lucky ball and play luck year, and then have the defensive numbers get juiced a little bit more than maybe they should be. And he might get there one day. And then Kopech gives you like the chance at 6+ years of control of a potential ace, even though it comes with some risk. Both of those guys were high variance, and like Montgomery and Teal are just, they don't offer that level of upside. And even if you include Montgomery with Teal, they don't offer that level of floor, because I think Kopech was like in Double-A at that point. Like he was pretty close to contributing at some point. So yeah, I would say that kind of fits, that if Sale has the history and an extra year of control for not that much more money than Crochet's getting, the 2 main prospects were better, and the 3rd and 4th guys were probably comparable. And also, I don't think that kind of package, like, I'm not sure we'll see that again. Like, I think obviously in like the Soto deal, you saw like those kinds of names thrown around. Also, I've mentioned this before, but when Washington was trading Soto to San Diego, they started with James Wood, and they wanted to add Jackson Merrill, and San Diego said no. And they said yes to almost everybody else, but they were like, you can't have both Merrill and Wood. Like we knew one of those guys would be a dude, maybe both of them. You can't have both of them.
Yeah.
And that's how they got to all those other names that were in that deal with Mackenzie Gore and Robert Hassel and all those guys, which obviously seems like really smart in retrospect, since like Wood seems like a guy. They were right to build it around him, but Merrill like might even be better.
Wait, so you're saying that you feel like the Crochet deal is equal to the Sale trade?
No, I'm saying like the quality of the trade, like getting a good return for the guy, I think
Yeah.
they are comparable. They sort of match the trade value of the player. I would argue that like Sale is at the level of guy, like 3 years of control of an ace under at a small price. You can only go to like the Soto level trades where it is a cost controlled superstar for 3 years. Like that doesn't happen very often. So there's not a lot of comps. And that's why Crochet gets, like, I think it's 1 tier below, getting 2 years of very cheap control of what looks like an ace or very close to it.
Yeah.
Like there's not a lot of, like, usually you would see Machado on a rental. Like those are really good players getting traded. You don't get multiple years cost controlled of like an obvious all-star. And so there's not a lot of like comps. I mean, I might be missing some, but those are the ones that like come to mind. Or you see like Arenado gets traded a little past his prime for a bunch of guaranteed money, and then they eat the money and they kind of get nothing in return. It's like those are the trades you normally see of really good players. There's not a ton of like, here's 3 top 100 prospects for an all-star with a bunch of control. Like teams just don't really do that anymore.
Yeah, but I'm just looking at that Sale trade. Moncada had to hit. And when I say hit, I mean hit. He at least had to go to 1 all-star game. He never came really close to that. Kopech, had needed Tommy John surgery. You can't predict, that. And then Basabe with the White Sox never made it past Birmingham, and Diaz was gone in a year. You compare that with this trade, and you got 2 first-round picks, right?
Yep.
In the last 2 years.
Recent guys that like haven't fallen off. They're like still what they're supposed to be.
Exactly. And then you've got 2 other guys who, all 4 of these guys are knocking on the door for the major leagues. You don't know what kind of major league careers they're going to
It
have.
would be a real upside if all 4 of these guys don't play in the big leagues. Like even if Montgomery is the low end of what I think he is, and he's like a platoon guy, like he's still obviously going to be in the big leagues unless he's just like a 210 hitter. Because also these guys get pushed to the big leagues when you're a former first round pick in AAA. Like they just put you there. But like if all these guys don't play at least like a full season, I would be surprised. Like they all should get there. And at the time, I think everyone saw the sale trade as like, oh, they got 2 guys, and like I guess they got some other guys too. Like even at the time when those guys were ranked 10th and 15th in the system or whatever it was, nobody thought about those guys being anything. Whereas Meidroth, everyone's just like, oh, this guy's going to be in the big leagues next season and will probably be like a nice role player, and you're hoping you get a little bit more. So yeah, the shape of it, and then also Teal not being a high variance guy, like it's just a different approach to things. That I think also makes sense. Like this organization needs hitters and high floor guys, and then hope that you get that like Jose Ramirez outcome where sometimes the high floor, low ceiling guy turns out to be a high ceiling guy and you just didn't realize it. Like there's a reason that the teams with no money that are really good, like Milwaukee and Tampa and other teams like that, they tend to take a lot of guys like this and they draft a lot of guys like this and they like create tens of millions of dollars of value every year taking guys like this, or guys that like don't throw strikes but have really good stuff, or guys that throw a lot of strikes that have mediocre stuff. Like just taking a risky dude with a bunch of tools that might not hit, like Moncada, like you're well aware of the risks of that, and you saw the whole thing, and it ended up being, I would say, on balance, based on when he was traded, probably a little disappointing relative to expectations.
A little?
Well, I mean, you can't expect the top 5 prospect in baseball to just like turn into like Juan Soto, but like obviously that happens.
No, make an all-star team.
Of the time, it should be like a 5-time all-star. And then 20-25% of the time, it's a guy like this that like kind of frustrates you, that gives you glimpses, that just doesn't quite do it. And then half the time, it's a guy that's like, good for 5 seasons. And then, like Aramis Ramirez, like was kind of bad for 5 seasons. Then he was kind of good for 6 seasons on another team. And it's like, all right, we were right, just like at the wrong time. And it was kind of annoying how it happened.
Yeah.
And well, so the way that I look at it in the Aramis Ramirez to lower area where you're like, that wasn't what we wanted, but it was something, but we would have liked more.
Yeah. Just one last thing. The way that I compare these 2 trades, it's tough to totally compare them, but like, I'm just going off of how I see it. They looked at Yoan Moncada, saw his potential, probably scouted him. Did they really know him? They really, I think, did a deep dive on Braden Montgomery, on Kyle Teel, because they were considering drafting them.
I was gonna say they, like everybody did. Yeah. So it's right. Recent enough that you have to know about the makeup because it can't have changed that much.
Exactly. So I think, as we're looking at things and splitting hairs here, I think that is, I would hope that, that is something where the White Sox feel they're going to get more of what they expect, certainly from a character standpoint, from those guys than Moncada. I'm not saying Moncada was a piece of blank. I'm just saying they just looked at the rankings and said, looked at the talent and go, yeah, we want that. We'll take that. Not go doing a deeper dive on everything like they did with Teal and Montgomery.
And I would say I hadn't thought about that before, but the idea of trading for guys that were recently drafted that what they are. I mean, you don't always know every player really well. Like maybe the White Sox weren't on Meidroth enough to have done, pre-draft stuff on him. Not a lot of teams were. But obviously Montgomery and Teal were. Like those are guys, like I have been watching both of those guys since they were sophomore, juniors in high school. So like it's really hard not to know those guys. But going for that guy, you're probably not going to get, as a recent first round pick, the ones that have a chance to be superstars a year or two later, they don't get traded. So getting the ones that have a chance to be good or come with some risk, and the makeup, you're not going to get that Moncada Kopech upside. Like that's not how that equation works out. But in terms of, we don't want a makeup based miss, taking guys from the last draft or two is a smart approach for a team that is dealing with that specific question. Because I can imagine, like, if you have some misses in that area and you're like a little trigger shy, that is one way to solve for that I haven't heard teams talk about a lot, but that is the way you solve that problem.
All right, one last thing. Where are the White Sox right now with their farm system and their future as you see it? As you look at the board, I'm looking at your board. Yeah,
I got my board over here. So I had them at 9th at the end of the season after all the trades. And they were, I think, like 18th or 20th before at the beginning of this. Actually, no, I have the number here. They were 20th at this time last year. And then they were 9th at the end of the deadline with all the draft guys and the trade guys coming in. And I haven't like totally updated this, but it looks like they're somewhere in like the 3 to 5 area now. I think they actually jumped over the Red Sox because the Red Sox gave them 2 of their big prospects. So they went down and the White Sox went up. So yeah, I think they are pretty clearly not first or second. And I think they're in that 3 to 5 area, up from 9 at the end of the season. Like, I guess entirely because of this trade.
Oh, so you have them third between third
guys around, so they could move up or down a little bit from there. But I think that's where they're going to end up, is somewhere in the 3 to 5 area.
That is a big jump to be from where they were just a year ago. You say 20th to
20th, year before that 26th, year before that 30th. So yeah, like almost as bad as you can be in a 3-year run where you're not like winning the World Series, to be at the bottom third 3 years in a row, and then jump 11 spots in one season, and then jump 6 more spots at the beginning of an offseason. I mean, that's the way you draw up like a rebuild, is like when you flick the switch, is we're going to go from not a good system to a good system, because we're not going to lose anybody and we're going to add guys. And hopefully guys you have get better, and, you know, all the systems are going in the right direction. Yeah, I actually hadn't looked at that yet. So I'm glad you forced me to look at it.
I see a story in your future, by the way.
Yeah, no, maybe if only I could have predicted that ahead of time.
Yeah, but I mean, I think White Sox fans have been through this before, as was I, just seeing how it transpired. And there's a lot of things to learn from the failed rebuild of what happened. It wasn't just, I think the rebuild was fine in terms of the trades that they made, in terms of like what they got back, because their farm system went up just like yours did. But it was maybe the wrong guys, or they just didn't, have the support in the minor leagues to make up for underperformance, injuries, whatever it might be. But so you think things are trending in the right direction for the White Sox?
Yes, and I should say, because this has happened with a couple teams in the past before, when they go from very low in the rankings to very high, because I have it as like a math problem. Like, you move the players around, they move up automatically. What usually happens when the team goes from very low to very high in a bunch of trades is you end up with a bunch of dudes that are going to graduate during the season. So it goes from 20th to 9th to 3rd or 4th. And then by the middle of next season, 5 of your top 8 guys have graduated, and then you're 18th again. Like, that's the pattern they're on. And also, like, the point of these rankings is to fall. Like, the Braves have been in the bottom 5 the whole time, because by the time we realize they have a good prospect, he's in the big leagues getting Rookie of the Year votes. So, like, the point of it is, like, to not be high, because all the value you have is in the big leagues. Like, that's the reason this exists. So it is like a bit of a useless exercise, or like it's an indicator of what could happen in the future. It's not, here's how good you are at this. Because also there's teams that draft guys and trade them, and they get a bunch of big league value and win World Series, but they're always in the bottom 5, and they always complain to me. And I'm like, you should complain into your rings. Like, get them out and yell at them and say like, oh, we're 26th in farm rankings. Because they think that means that as a scout works in the draft, that they're doing a bad job. And I'm like, right. Obviously you're not. Like, you'd be fired if you're doing a bad job. So I would keep an eye on that between Montgomery, Schultz, Teal, Hagen Smith, Caro, Iriarte, Brian Ramos, potentially Jacob Gonzalez, Jake Eater, Meidroth, Leisure, maybe Grant Taylor if things go really well, and Nastrini, all those guys, and then Gonzalez. All those guys are on here. Maybe a couple of them have graduated. Baroa, Deloche. There's a bunch of dude, Kai Bush. Like, all those guys, like half those guys have already debuted, and will, like, probably, if they're any good, get in the big leagues and lose eligibility pretty quickly. But again, the thing I wanted to say earlier was, and this is like another sort of like secret thing that happens with teams that are rebuilding. We're seeing a little bit of it with the Mets, because they have such a good AA and AAA group of prospects coming up, is if you have, let's say the White Sox have $150 million to spend on 26 players. If you have like 3 guys at the minimum that are prospects that just came up, that are bench guys, it doesn't really save you any money. You were going to spend $3 or $4 million on those players, and you're getting them for free. Hopefully they turn into starters. If you're like the Mets, where you have like Vientos, and you're about to have Jet Williams, and you got Ronnie Mauricio, and then you've got Christian Scott, and you got like these guys in key spots, like number 3, number 4 starter, setup guy, a couple guys in the lineup, and you're at the minimum, all of a sudden you've got $147 million to spend on 12 guys. And now you're averaging over $10 million per other player. And when I was in Atlanta and we were laying out the whole, like, all right, so we got Acuna, we got Albies, we got Austin Riley, we got Soroka and Fried and whatever. We're like, we kind of have to have 3 Freddie Freemans, because how else are we going to spend this money? There's no more spots on the field to spend this money on. You got to spend $20 million on all those guys. Yeah. Even though it's not really what we do, because otherwise, where are you going to spend the money? You can't have like 3 middle relievers making $6 million each that aren't going to pitch that much in important situations. So the sort of goal of this is not necessarily Corey Lee has to be an all-star. It's, well, if you don't have to pay whoever the version of Alex Avila is $6 million to be a backup left-handed hitting catcher, and you pay this guy $500K, it's like, well, that's $5.5 million. And now that money goes to somebody else. And once you do that 3 times, all of a sudden you got $20 million to spend, and you can go sign like Corbin Burns or something. And like
that's what I was trying to explain that for the White Sox, like you want this to happen with a lot of these guys coming up and making the bare minimum for the next 3 years.
And even if it turns out none of them are all-stars, like they're all just pretty good, you're supposed to get the all-star for the 20 or 30 million for the guys you save. And that's what Baltimore is doing right now, is they got a couple stars with, Rutschman and Gunnar Henderson and those guys. So they don't have to sign the $30 million guy, but they have the money as though they could. And because Mike Elias, the GM there, like doesn't like spending $200 million on a player, he's now having to confront like, well, if I just go get Craig Kimbrell for $12 million, he might be nothing. But if I go get like Devin Williams for 5 for 100, I'm going to have like a really good closer for 3 years. So like he's got to decide how he wants to spend that money to build that team. In the same way that having 3 good catchers is not a problem, having a bunch of young players that haven't turned into all-stars yet, but they're like decent big leaguers you want to have around, that then gives you the ability to do the stuff that every fan wants to see, which is spend $700 million in one offseason on a bunch of stars, because like you then have the money to actually buy those guys, even if the owner doesn't want to do it or the commitments aren't quite right. Like the math problem works in your favor, and that's like the second order. Like you want the Baltimore thing, all the homegrown stars signing extensions and all that kind of thing, like the Braves. But like the second order thing is you've got a bunch of money for 3 spots, and that's pretty good too.
Good stuff. I learned a lot here from you, Kylie. Appreciate it. I feel like I'm in the room. I'm in the draft room. I feel like I'm in a front office, and these are the conversations that these guys have, and I really appreciate it.
I can tell you this is literally a lot of the conversations. Like I can't tell you everything they're saying, but like there's a lot of this stuff going on.
Yeah. All right, Kiley McDaniel, read his stuff at ESPN and be on the lookout for his story about the White Sox.
Yeah, maybe I'll predict another trade. Who knows?
All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We got a big week of podcasts coming your way. Hawk Harrelson, take it away.
All right, Chuck. This edition of the White Sox Podcast is over.